In the spring of 1871, a black family in rural Alabama brought their 12-year-old daughter, named Sarah, to a traveling doctor who was passing through their county offering medical consultations to freedmen who could not afford regular physicians. The parents explained that Sarah had always been small for her age, but that over the past 2 years, they had become increasingly concerned because while other children her age were growing rapidly through puberty, Sarah remained the size of a 7 or 8-year-old child, had not developed any secondary sexual characteristics, and appeared in most physical respects to be frozen at a developmental stage she should have passed through years earlier. The doctor, a man named Thomas Crawford, who had served as a Union Army surgeon during the Civil War and who had remained in the South afterward to provide medical care to formerly enslaved people, examined Sarah carefully and was struck by the extraordinary nature of her condition. She was intellectually normal for her age, speaking and reasoning at a 12-year-old level and showing no signs of cognitive impairment. But physically, she appeared to be approximately 7 years old, standing only 3 feet 9 inches tall, weighing approximately 45 pounds, and showing none of the physical maturation that should have occurred during the previous 5 years. Over the next decade, Dr. Crawford would document Sarah's case as she continued to fail to age physically despite growing older chronologically, creating one of the earliest and most detailed medical records of what would later be understood as a growth hormone deficiency. But what, in 1871, could not be explained by any known medical theory, and what appeared to be a complete mystery that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. Before we descend into Sarah's story and the medical mystery that baffled every doctor who examined her, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we explore the medical mysteries that science struggled to understand. Sarah was born in 1859 in Alabama, the daughter of people who had been enslaved until the end of the Civil War in 1865, and who gained their freedom when she was approximately 6 years old. Her early childhood during slavery was spent on a plantation where her parents worked as field laborers, and the conditions of her infancy and early childhood were probably typical of enslaved children's experiences. Inadequate nutrition, minimal medical care, and the trauma of living under a system that treated children as property that could be sold away from parents at any time. Sarah's parents later reported that she had been born smaller than normal and had always grown more slowly than other children, but they had attributed this to the poor conditions of slavery and had assumed that once they were free and could provide better care, Sarah would catch up to normal developmental milestones. For the first few years after emancipation, this seemed to be happening. Sarah grew somewhat and appeared to be developing normally, if slowly. But by 1869 or 1870, when Sarah was 10 or 11 years old, it became increasingly obvious that something was seriously wrong with her development, because she remained the size of a much younger child and showed no signs of the rapid growth spurt that normally occurred during puberty. Dr. Crawford's initial examination of Sarah in 1871 was thorough by the standards of the time, though it could not identify the underlying cause of her condition, because the medical knowledge necessary to understand growth hormone deficiency would not be developed until the 20th century. Crawford measured Sarah's height, weight, and various body proportions, finding that she was proportionate for a 7 or 8-year-old child, but dramatically underdeveloped for her actual age of 12. He examined her for signs of other medical conditions that might explain growth failure, including chronic infections, heart or lung problems, or kidney disease, but found no evidence of such conditions. He tested her intellectual development through conversation and simple tasks, determining that her mental age matched her chronological age, and that whatever was affecting her physical growth was not affecting her cognitive development. He questioned her parents extensively about her medical history, about family history of similar conditions, and about environmental factors, including nutrition and living conditions, that might be contributing to growth failure. The examination revealed a mystery, a child who was intellectually normal but physically frozen. At a developmental stage she should have passed through years ago, with no obvious disease or injury to explain the condition. The social context of Sarah S. case was important. Because she was a formerly enslaved black child being examined by a white doctor in Alabama during Reconstruction, a period of enormous racial tension and violence as white, Southerners resisted the social and political changes that followed. Confederate defeat and emancipation. Dr. Crawford was unusual among white doctors in his willingness to provide medical care to black patients and to take their medical concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them as the complaints of people whose health did not matter or who were exaggerating minor ailments. But even Crawford operated within limitations imposed by the racism of his era, and his documentation of Sarah S. case reflected assumptions about racial differences in development and about black people supposedly inferior physical characteristics that were common in 19th century medical thought. Some of his observations about Sarah Huss' condition included speculation that her failure to mature might be related to her race or to the physical effects of slavery on her parents' generation. Speculation that was not supported by evidence, but that reflected the racist scientific paradigms of the time. Despite these limitations, Crawford's documentation of Sarah Huss' case was valuable because it provided detailed measurements and observations over many years that would later allow 20th century physicians to retrospectively diagnose her condition. Over the decade from 1871 to 1881, Dr. Crawford examined Sarah approximately once per year, documenting her continued failure to age physically despite normal cognitive development and normal chronological aging. When Sarah was 14 in 1873, she remained approximately the size of an 8-year-old, having grown perhaps an inch and gained a few pounds, but showing no signs of puberty. When she was 16 in 1875, she still had not menstruated and had not developed breasts or other secondary sexual characteristics. When she was 18 in 1877, she appeared physically to be approximately 9 or 10 years old, still far below normal adult height and weight, and still prepubertal in all physical characteristics. Sarah's intellectual and emotional development continued normally. She was capable of adult reasoning and conversation. She expressed age-appropriate concerns and interests, and she apparently understood that her physical condition was unusual and that it isolated her socially from people her own age. But physically, she remained a child in appearance, even as she became an adult in years and in mental development. The psychological and social effects of Sarah's condition were profound and created challenges that the medical documentation only partially captured. Sarah could not participate in normal adolescent and young adult social life because her physical appearance made her seem like a child, even though she was mentally an adult. She could not work in jobs that required physical strength or that involved interaction with people who would need to take her seriously as an adult. She faced constant questions and stares from people who saw a child-sized person, but who heard adult speech and reasoning. She could not form romantic relationships because no one her actual age would consider her as a partner, given her childlike appearance, and older teenagers or adults who might be attracted to her appearance would be engaging in what appeared to be inappropriate interest in a child. Sarah's parents struggled with how to navigate her social isolation and how to help her build a life when her physical condition made normal adult roles impossible. The community's response to Sarah varied from sympathy to suspicion to exploitation, with some people treating her kindly, but others viewing her as a curiosity or even as something supernatural that should be feared or avoided. The medical theories that Dr. Crawford and other doctors who examined Sarah considered to explain her condition reflected the limited understanding of endocrinology and developmental biology in the 1870s. The concept of hormones would not be articulated until the early 20th century, and the specific understanding of growth hormone and its role in development would not emerge until the 1920s and later. 19th century doctors understood that growth was regulated by some physiological process, but they had no clear model for what that process was or how it might malfunction. Crawford's theories about Sarah's condition included possibilities that her pituitary gland, which was known to exist but whose function was not understood, might be abnormally small or damaged, that her thyroid might not be functioning properly, that she might have some nutritional deficiency that prevented normal development despite appearing adequately fed, or that her condition might be the result of some unknown disease or developmental disorder. All these theories were partially correct, but could not be proven or tested with the medical technology available in the 1870s and 1880s. The question of whether Sarah's condition was related to her experiences during slavery and immediately after emancipation was raised by Crawford and by Sarah's parents, though it could not be answered definitively. It was known that malnutrition and chronic stress during childhood could affect development, and Sarah had certainly experienced both during her first 6 years of life while enslaved. It was possible that damage during this critical developmental period had permanently affected her growth potential, or had damaged her endocrine system in ways that prevented normal development later, even when conditions improved. But it was also possible that Sarah's condition was genetic, or was the result of some developmental abnormality that occurred before birth, and that had nothing to do with the conditions of her childhood. Without modern diagnostic tools or genetic testing, there was no way to determine causation, and the question remained speculative. The connection to slavery was important psychologically and politically because it raised questions about the lasting damage that slavery had done to people who had survived it, and about the obligations that society had to provide care and support for people whose health had been damaged by slavery's violence and deprivation. As Sarah reached her 20s during the late 1870s and early 1880s, her condition remained essentially unchanged. She appeared physically to be approximately 9 or 10 years old, while being 21 or 22 years old chronologically and mentally. She had settled into a life where she lived with her parents and helped with household work that she could manage given her physical size and strength. She apparently never married or formed a romantic partnership, probably because her appearance made such relationships impossible in a society where her childlike appearance would have been interpreted as inappropriate for an adult relationship. She maintained friendships within her community among people who knew her and who understood her condition, though she remained socially isolated from broader society where she would have been seen as a curiosity or as something to be feared. Crawford continued documenting her case and corresponded with other doctors about her condition, trying to determine if similar cases had been observed elsewhere and if any treatments might help her. But no treatments were identified, and no other well-documented cases of similar conditions were found in the medical literature of the time, making Sarah's case appear unique and unexplainable. Sarah died in 1889 at the age of 30, still appearing physically to be a pre-pubertal child despite 3 decades of life. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, which was a common killer in the late 19th century before antibiotics became available. But it was noted that her unusually small size and apparent developmental abnormalities may have contributed to her vulnerability to the infection. Dr. Crawford was still alive when Sarah died, and he documented her death as the conclusion of a case that had spanned nearly 20 years of observation and that remained medically mysterious despite all the attention it had received. Crawford arranged for Sarah's body to be donated to a medical school for autopsy and further study, hoping that examination of her organs and tissues might reveal clues about what had caused her condition. The autopsy report, which survives in medical archives, confirmed Crawford's clinical observations. Sarah's organs were all proportionately sized for a pre-pubertal child rather than for an adult. Her skeletal development had essentially stopped years before it should have, and her reproductive organs had never matured. The autopsy also noted that Sarah's pituitary gland was unusually small, an observation that could not be properly interpreted in '89, but that would later be understood as consistent with pituitary insufficiency and growth hormone deficiency. The retrospective diagnosis of Sarah's condition became possible in the 20th century as medical science developed understanding of how hormones regulated growth and development. By the 1920s and 1930s, researchers had identified growth hormone as a substance produced by the pituitary gland that was essential for normal growth during childhood and adolescence. And they had documented that insufficient growth hormone production resulted in proportionate dwarfism and failure to reach sexual maturity, exactly the pattern that Sarah had exhibited. Later research in the 1950s and beyond developed treatments for growth hormone deficiency, including synthetic hormones that could be administered to children with the condition, treatments that allowed them to achieve near normal height and to develop sexually if treatment was started early enough. Sarah's case was retrospectively cited in medical literature as an early documentation of what would come to be called panhypopituitarism, a condition where the pituitary gland fails to produce adequate amounts of multiple hormones, including growth hormone, leading to growth failure and failure to reach sexual maturity. The condition could be caused by genetic mutations, by damage to the pituitary during development, or by various diseases or injuries affecting the brain region where the pituitary is located. In Sarah's case, the cause could not be determined from the historical records, but the pattern of her symptoms fit the diagnosis clearly. The question of whether Sarah's condition could have been treated if she had lived a century later is both medical and ethical. Modern treatments for growth hormone deficiency can be highly effective if started during childhood before growth plates close, allowing children who would otherwise remain very short to reach near normal adult height and to develop sexually normally. But such treatment requires early diagnosis and sustained hormone replacement therapy for years, and it carries some risks and side effects. If Sarah had been born in the late 20th century, instead of 1859, she would likely have been diagnosed with pituitary insufficiency by age 8 or 10 based on her growth failure, and she could have been treated with growth hormone replacement that would have allowed more normal development. She still would have been shorter than average and might have experienced ongoing health issues related to pituitary insufficiency, but she would not have remained child-sized into adulthood and would not have experienced the complete failure of sexual maturation that she actually endured. The fact that this suffering could have been prevented with modern medical knowledge makes Sarah's story both a historical medical curiosity and a reminder of how recently many now treatable conditions were complete mysteries that doctors could observe but not treat. The documentation of Sarah's case by Dr. Crawford was valuable not just for what it revealed about her specific condition, but for what it demonstrated about the importance of careful clinical observation and long-term follow-up in advancing medical knowledge. Crawford examined Sarah repeatedly over 20 years, carefully measuring and recording her physical development, or lack thereof, and her cognitive development. And he preserved this documentation in medical journals and in correspondence with other physicians. This created a detailed case study that could be analyzed by later generations of doctors who had the theoretical frameworks and diagnostic tools to understand what Crawford was observing but could not explain. Crawford's work exemplified the tradition of careful clinical documentation that has been essential to medical progress, allowing patterns to be identified and hypotheses to be tested even when immediate explanations were unavailable. Without Crawford's detailed records, Sarah's case would have been lost to history as just another unexplained death, rather than being preserved as early documentation of a condition that would later be understood and treatable. The broader significance of Sarah's case extended to questions about how medical knowledge develops and about the gap between observation and explanation that characterizes many periods of medical history. Doctors in the 1870s and 1880s could observe that some children failed to grow normally and that various patterns of developmental abnormality existed, but they lacked the theoretical frameworks and the diagnostic tools to explain why these abnormalities occurred or to predict their course. They could measure and describe, but could not diagnose in the modern sense of identifying underlying causes. This meant that patients like Sarah received careful observation and documentation, but no effective treatment, and that doctors experienced the frustration of witnessing suffering they could not alleviate, because they did not understand the mechanisms that would need to be targeted for treatment. The experience of these 19th century doctors was similar to what modern doctors experience with rare conditions that are not yet well understood, where detailed description and long-term observation are possible, but effective treatments remain elusive. The social implications of Sarah's story included what it revealed about how communities dealt with people whose physical appearances or capabilities differed dramatically from norms. Sarah's community in rural Alabama apparently accepted her and made space for her despite her unusual condition, allowing her to live with family and to participate in community life to the extent her physical limitations allowed. This suggested that at least some communities in the post-emancipation South were capable of tolerance and inclusion for people with disabilities or unusual conditions, contradicting narratives that portrayed such communities as universally hostile to difference. But Sarah's life was also constrained by her condition in ways that revealed the limits of that tolerance. She could not work in many jobs because of her physical size, and because people would not take her seriously as an adult. She could not form romantic relationships because her appearance made such relationships impossible or inappropriate, and she remained socially isolated from normal adult life in ways that created profound loneliness and limitation. The balance between inclusion and exclusion, between acceptance and marginalization, that characterized Sarah's social experience illustrated the complex ways that communities navigated difference when formal support systems did not exist. The ethics of medical research and documentation in Sarah's case raised questions that remain relevant for modern medical practice. Dr. Crawford documented Sarah's condition extensively and shared that documentation with other doctors through publications and correspondence, making her a subject of medical study without her explicit consent or without providing her compensation for her participation in advancing medical knowledge. This was standard practice in 19th century medicine, where patients were generally not asked to consent to having their cases documented or published, and where the assumption was that doctors had the right to study and write about any cases they encountered. Modern medical ethics requires informed consent for research participation and generally prohibits publishing identifiable case information without patient permission, recognizing that patients have rights to privacy and autonomy that must be respected. Applying modern ethical standards retroactively to historical cases is complicated, but Sarah's case raises questions about how the benefits of medical documentation and knowledge advancement should be balanced against individual rights to privacy and dignity, questions that medical ethics continues to grapple with today. What should we remember about Sarah and her condition that baffled 19th century doctors, and that can now be understood as growth hormone deficiency? That she was born in 1859 into slavery, that she was freed at age 6, and that by age 12 it was obvious that her physical development was dramatically delayed compared to normal children her age. That Dr. Crawford documented her case carefully from 1871 through her death in 1889, creating detailed records of a child who aged chronologically and mentally, but who remained physically frozen at approximately age 7 or 8 throughout her adolescence and early adulthood. That she lived to age 30, while appearing physically to be approximately 9 or 10 years old, never achieving sexual maturity and never growing to normal adult height. That 19th century doctors could observe and document her condition, but could not explain it or treat it because growth hormone and pituitary function were not yet understood. That retrospective analysis using 20th century medical knowledge identified her condition as panhypopituitarism, resulting from pituitary insufficiency, a condition that is now treatable if diagnosed early. That her case demonstrated both the importance of careful clinical documentation for advancing medical knowledge and the frustration of witnessing suffering that could be observed but not alleviated. and that her life illustrated the social challenges faced by people whose physical development differed dramatically from norms, including isolation, limitation, and the complex balance between community acceptance and social exclusion. What do you think about medical conditions like Sarah's that could be observed and documented but not explained or treated given the limitations of 19th century medical knowledge? How should we balance appreciation for careful clinical documentation against awareness that such documentation was conducted without modern standards of informed consent and patient rights? What does Sarah's case tell us about the gap between medical observation and medical understanding that has characterized many periods of medical history? And how should we think about the social and psychological challenges faced by people whose physical conditions make them appear dramatically different from their chronological age? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Sarah's story of a girl who never aged physically and the medical mystery that baffled doctors for decades challenged your understanding of how medical knowledge develops and demonstrated the importance of careful documentation, even when immediate explanations are unavailable, hit that subscribe button for Epic of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore medical mysteries that challenged the doctors of their time and that reveal how scientific understanding advances through careful observation over generations. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that many now treatable conditions were complete mysteries a century ago, and that patients like Sarah suffered from conditions that doctors could observe but not help. Sarah never aged like other children. Science failed to explain her condition during her lifetime, but her case helped later generations understand growth hormone deficiency and develop treatments that prevent children today from experiencing what she endured. Remember Sarah. Remember the medical mystery she represented. And remember that advancing medical knowledge requires documenting mysteries even when we cannot yet explain them.